Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, so I'm Patrick Bell with the Oklahoma Native Plant Society.
Patrick, turn your mic on.
Do I have to?
Is it on? Okay.
Can you hear me okay now? Okay. Welcome. I'm Patrick Bell with the Oklahoma Native Plant Society. We couldn't have done this without the generous support of the University of Central Oklahoma, also in conjunction with the Tulsa Audubon Society, Jinx Public Schools, Wild Care, and who else are we missing? The Norman Public Library System. I had a conversation with Dr. Tallamy yesterday, and I said, well, how do people normally introduce you? And he said, well, I always tell them, here's Doug. But it never happens. And I said, well, how many talks have you given? He said, oh, 5,000 or 6,000. Everybody here knows him. He knows what he's written about. So for the second time in your life, here's Doug.
Hey, you know, I'm just realizing I've got to look at the screen and I can't see it. Well, how about if I stand over here? Is that okay? Am I blocking anybody? Okay, thanks for coming today. I'm enjoying my trip to Oklahoma. This is my third, even though we had some postponement. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's get started. I want to tell you about my idea of what nature's best hope is, but before I do that, I want to tell you what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope is. Of course, Edward O. Wilson died the day after Christmas this year. It's a terrible loss to a field of conservation, to lots of fields. He created entire disciplines, very long career at Harvard. But one thing that was consistent throughout his career was his effort to save biodiversity on planet Earth. He loved nature. He knew that we absolutely needed it. And this was his best effort here. In 2016, he wrote this book called Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And his message was very clear. If we don't save nature, if we don't save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, we're not going to save life on any of the planet. So it's pretty stark message. So he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. We need to save half of planet Earth. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were actually going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to conservation biologists, that's great news. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be really good. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got almost 8 billion people, might be 8 billion people by today. It was very, very close. On the other half, along with all of our roads and airports and detritus, and we don't have a third half to put aside for planet Earth. So a lot of people are wondering how we can actually do that. And that's what I want to talk about today. I do think we can realize E.O.'s dream, but we're going to need a new approach to conservation in order to do that. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019. We had a very large oak mast within the red oak group. All the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And that's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Then it fell down, and that's a dangerous time for that insect larva because a lot of things want to eat it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber, and within that chamber converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, it stays there underground as a pupa for 2 years. Come back here. After 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they come out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After they leave the acorn, though, they leave a hole, a true vacuum, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they leave acorns. And if scouts find a new acorn with a new hole, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move, time to grab the larvae, grab the eggs. The entire colony moves into the new acorns in about 30 minutes. And then they post a guard right there to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of interactions, largely between plants and animals, very specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree. They tap it below the surface of the soil. And then the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. Well, for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have, this isn't my clicker, I'm not used to it. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilia, unless you have Facilia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that that bee can rear its young on. Now we've got 4,000 species of native bees in this country. Only one honeybee, but 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them are highly specialized on particular pollens. They can only rear their young on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot without white turtlehead. Just specialization galore. I could talk about it the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of the year. My point, though, is that today these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Now come back here. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, looked out over its wonderful view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. We didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state, and those places are largely mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. Come back here. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You could spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other countries, other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we need to run the ecosystems to provide the support that keeps humans alive. You might wonder why we've done that. I wonder why we've done that. And I don't know, but I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. We were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline, followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. Already gone. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. And then the UN says, well, in the next 20 years, we're likely to lose 1 million species to extinction, which of course is forever. And they said that 2 years ago, so now it's 18 years. It makes a very nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. We cannot lose these species. These are the species that keep us alive on planet Earth. It's time we took it seriously. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver, come back here, enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if we lost insects way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. Nobody listened to him, but he wrote the paper anyway. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects, believe it or not. Because if we lost our insects, we would lose most of our flowering plants. And if we lost most of our flowering plants, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds and mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, though, and that is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. We must save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We're totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems provide us. We call them ecosystem services. These are just a few things that plants do for us right here. They produce oxygen, pretty important. They clean our water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. They capture carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, build their tissues out of it. And then even more important, they're pumping carbon into the ground through their root systems. And this makes even small plants like prairie plants really important. And once the carbon is in the ground, that's why our soils are brown or black, it's very stable. It'll stay there thousands of years. All we have to do is get it out of the air and put it back into the ground. They build topsoil. They hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. Plants convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we would have to eat sunlight. That will be hard. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds and many other things. So designing landscapes like this is just not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before because we got all those people demanding them. And of course, we keep taking them, but that's what pulls those resources away from other species, and that's why we have these problems. Now, we do have parks and we have preserves, and we have been depending on them to do these jobs in the past, but it's obviously not working. If it was working, we wouldn't be in the 6th great extinction. So we now need to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on properties just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, moving to another area, doing the same thing. Clearly not sustainable behavior. But Aldo had a lot of faith in humans. He believed that we were smart enough to develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth, we had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed that we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, But I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together, they cannot coexist, was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have seen it as an option. What I want to argue this afternoon, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only option left to us. What does this say? In the past, conservationists worked pretty much where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Let's think about that private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private properties, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not really using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left, no doubt. But I'm really talking about putting it back together on all the places where we've destroyed it. Restoration. But before you tell me, well, you're never going to restore it to exactly what it was, I know that. When it was, who knows? But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions that comprise healthy ecosystems, that comprise nature, to form ecosystem function again. Whether it's exactly what was at that space or not before, it doesn't matter. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks of nature. All species don't contribute to ecosystem function equally. And there are two groups we can't do without: the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis turning it into food, simple sugars and carbohydrates, which they're storing in their tissues, largely their leaves. And that is the food that keeps all of the animals on the planet, some very, very minor exceptions, alive. Well, now we have all the food stored in plant parts. If we don't get it to animals, it's not going to do animals any good. And it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants, and those invertebrates are typically insects, and not just any insects. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of insect. So if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. We've got a lot of data on chickadees, but the Carolina chickadee is just like the black-capped chickadee, which is just like the mountain chickadee, which is just like almost all the other birds that are out there. So chickadees are at our feeders all winter long, eating seeds, and that gives us the impression that that's what they need. Well, 50% of a chickadee's diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50%, even in the wintertime, is insects and spiders. But when they go to reproduce, their babies, their young, cannot eat seeds at all. So they have to switch entirely to invertebrates, largely insects, and not just any insects. If they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young almost exclusively on caterpillars, and they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a lot of evidence that suggests that, but this is a citizen science project that Ashley Kennedy, one of my students a few years ago, finished. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country, some of you might have participated, and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're bringing food to the nest and send them to me, Ashley, and I will identify the prey items that are in the beak and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds as possible. And it was very successful. She got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. This is a summary of her results and the 20 most common bird families that she got pictures for. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that are caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we designed landscapes without enough caterpillars? Most of our terrestrial birds would not be able to reproduce. So something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. That thin wrapper is his exoskeleton. It's its cuticle. It's made of chitin, and it's undigestible, so the birds don't want a lot of that. And because they're soft, they can stuff that caterpillar down the throat of their baby without fear of injuring the esophagus. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. It's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're high in fat, high in protein, very low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because they are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids? From what they eat, of course, but look, carotenoid content of bird prey items is not equally distributed. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars, far more carotenoids than most other types, well, than all other types of insects. Here are the adult caterpillars right here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting very convincingly that caterpillars, for most birds, are not optional. They're essential components of their diet. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get that nest to the point where those chicks fledge, where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So for that single nest of a bird that weighs 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird, it takes tens of thousands of caterpillars to create the next generation. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we don't landscape in a way that creates all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original study of Rosenberg et al., the Smithsonian group, that said we have lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects at some part of their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that don't require insects when they're breeding. So things like finches and doves can actually make a little milk out of the seeds that they eat and feed that to their babies. And look, the species that do not require insects did not decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that do require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. Now, it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose birds. So we don't want to lose birds. We don't want to lose all the other things that depend on insects. So we need to add to our goals of landscaping. In the past, we've had one simple goal. We're going to make our landscapes pretty. That's it. Well, now we want to make pretty landscapes that are also ecologically functional. And we're not going to do that unless we have caterpillars in the landscapes. So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems pretty simple, but there is a catch. And that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we choose for landscaping, or at least which plants we are including. And we have to be fussy about it because most of the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. Not uniquely, it's just like most of the other caterpillars out there. But you can have all the calorie pear and all the camellias and all the burning bush and all the ginkgo and all the things that we typically landscape with from Asia in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly, as you know, is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization, and most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants don't want to be eaten. Plants have made them specialized. Plants defend their tissues with nasty chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, go out after this talk and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it because it's a there's a reason that we can't get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. It's a really successful defense that keeps most of the plants of the world, most of the insects of the world, from eating most of the plants of the world. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. They can only eat particular plant lineages for which they have developed specialized adaptations to help them get around those chemical defenses. So they develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations, and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of exposure to the plant in order for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant lineages. So if you take the milkweed out of your yard and put hostas in, don't expect the monarch to start developing on your hostas. Can't do it. It has two choices: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. There are three kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there are plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. A great example of a contributor would be one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy than anything else, any other type of plant. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Ginkgo. Our friend the ginkgo is a good example of a non-contributor. It's not invasive, it's not moving around, but it's not contributing anything either. Nothing can eat a ginkgo. And calorie pear would be a great example of a detractor. A very popular ornamental plant, but it escapes and is highly invasive, totally replacing the native plants that do contribute to local ecosystems. So that's a typical invasive species. They're ecological tumors that castrate our local ecosystems. So we don't want to tolerate them. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild food webs to make functional ecosystems, we have to think about the plants that we're putting in those ecosystems. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how easy this actually can be, how easily you can restore life to a particular place if you do think about those plants. I'm going to start with my house right here. It's where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. It was part of a farm in southeast Pennsylvania that was broken up, a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years, into 10-acre lots. And the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there was very little there. And our goal was it was covered with invasive species because it had been out of mowing for 3 years. So it was to get rid of those invasive species and then start to rebuild the food web. But this was year 2000. This was 5 years before I started bringing nature home, and I didn't know what I was doing. But I did know that I liked caterpillars, and it was an awful lot of fun to try to put caterpillars back. I didn't know they turned out to be the most important thing. But one of the things I tried early on was to see if I could get the Canadian owlet, that's a Canadian owlet, to make a living at our house. We didn't have any Canadian owlets. And I chose the Canadian owlet in a very scientific way. I went through Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty one. So let's do that. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you read, what do Canadian owlets eat? Meadow rue. They're a host plant specialist on meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. No meadow rue anywhere around us. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, and I planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. Who knew where they were going to come from? So I didn't even go out and check my patch of meadow rue until about 2 months later. I walked by for some other reason. I looked over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still surprised about that, but now we got a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow roost, so we've added 2 species to the property. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway, which is a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. That beautiful moth is a specialist on Biden's aristosa, that flower. I did know, we didn't have any Bidens, but I knew where some was. There was a good patch in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I went and got some seeds and planted them at home, and they grew very nicely. Well, it took a year for the moth to find my patch of Bidens, but it finally did, and now we got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be there. And beauty is not the only criterion when we're building landscapes. Well, as its name suggests, it's a specialist on Celtis, on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees, planted them. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry. Finally did. And so now we've got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 6 species to the property. And that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that specialize on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come. It's got beautiful little larvae, and they eat the goldenrod seeds. But this is it's still part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check my goldenrod plants right about now, looking for these guys. One of these years, I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I know a lot of people don't like it. I just don't know why they don't like it. It's a great native plant because it does so many things. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. It makes very nutritious berries that are high in fat, which the migrating birds in the fall require. It's a great pollinator plant. You wouldn't know it because its flowers are small and inconspicuous. You'd hardly even know it's in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not attractive for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best plant for supporting the large sphinx moths that are a critical component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at my house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. You know, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like that guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. We didn't have any American elm, but there were 2 big American elms, still are, at the University of Delaware that didn't die in the blight. And they make seed every year. It's wasted in the curbsides, but I scooped up some, I guess, the year after we moved in, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days, and well, it's now been, 21 years? They're about 80 feet tall. None of them have died, no special cultivars, and they attracted the double-toothed prominent. As a matter of fact, they're spreading seeds all over our property now, so we got good recruitment there. American elm. I want to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it. The moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that we've put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they're so important. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. It's huge. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. And I hear people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oaks when it's 400 years old, you're right. You won't. But if I can convince you to enjoy what your oaks are doing right from day one, you can enjoy them from day one. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of the oaks on my property as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which in my case, they were also free because somebody gave them to me. But they cost like $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web by bringing in the moths that create the caterpillars that transfer the energy to everything else. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown buccalatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. They come right away. I'm sorry, I'm just having a little trouble with this. This is the pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. Did it kill it? No, but the plant is doing its job. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support the life around you. Now, this is what our house looks like, taken from the same place I took the first picture. Today, we have a little lawn there, so we're very traditional, but we put a lot of plants back. And I'm still adding plants. But as our research progressed and we learned how important moths were, and you can actually count the number of moths in your food web and have a very good estimate of how powerful your food web is, about 5 years ago, I decided to actually try to do that. I was scared to do it. There's a lot of species of moths out there. But I was taking a picture of every species of moth that I have found, making a living at our house. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,182 species of moths that I have photographed at our house. Now, we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we're supporting 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flui, but bred. Why is this important? This is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. And that's a pretty scary statistic. It makes us all want to just give up. But I'm thinking, not at my house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. Imagine what would happen if everybody put the plants back, or if everybody in this room put the plants back. We can turn this around. We really can. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. What if you live in suburbia and you only have a quarter an acre or a small lot? Will it work on smaller pieces of property? And that's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in a typical development, and when they moved in, their lot was covered with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle, another plant from Asia. So they got rid of that. They planted, I think it's 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature, little bubbler for the birds, and then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard, and they are up to 149 bird species that they recorded using their yard, including 35 warbler species. If you know anything about birding, that's a good number. We've only recorded 8 warbler species at my house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about in urban properties and urban centers? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. The O'Hare Airport is right over that wall there. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a tiny little island. It's a beautiful island because Pam is a native plant landscaper. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, sat back, and as she tells me, she sits back with a glass of wine and counts the birds that have used her property. And she is up to 124 species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. There it is. Okay, there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of them is think about that big lawn that we have. Come back here. Today we have 44 million acres of lawn dedicated to an ecological deadscape. That's an area bigger than New England. And we have that because it's a status symbol. It conforms to our cultural norm at this point. And we also need it to display our Halloween decorations. So. But what if we cut that area of lawn in half? Let's make it simple. Let's say we got 40 million acres, going to cut it in half. That will give us 20 million acres. We're going to take areas like this and convert them to an area like this. This is Dan Getman. I don't know Dan Getman. He sent me this picture. I think he lives in Missouri, and he's converting what was a very large lawn. This is like the second year of the planning, so he's just getting going, but he's doing it. So what if we actually did that? So we'd have 20 million acres that we could dedicate to restoration, and we're doing it at home. So I said, well, gee, we can create a new national park that we can call Homegrown National Park, and it will be large. It will be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put some part of nature at home? When you create your park, you get the opportunity to develop or redevelop a personal relationship with the natural world. And you can do it at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. Or maybe even all you have to do is look out the window. You can avoid crowds. If you go to a real national park, 375 million people there last year. And you know what that means. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I think that's absolutely necessary if you're going to develop that personal relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And it's particularly important for our poor kids, who Richard Lewis says are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, they drive for an hour, and they get out and walk around. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. And they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing, but it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and become friends with it, get to know it, alone. No parental supervision. When we hover over our kids, we are sending a message. Even if we don't use the words, we're sending the message that this is dangerous stuff and you need to be protected. They will come home. I guarantee it. Send them out there alone. Let them get to know nature. Let them fall in love with it. And that's particularly important because they are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know that, if they don't know how to be a steward, if they don't love stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of lawn which is much smaller than this stage and a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe in great detail how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so that the lizards won't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard, you fall in love with the lizard. You're learning how to be a steward of Mother Nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture. Actually, yesterday, she called me up and told me about the two-tailed lizard she found in great detail. We don't have time for that story. But I guarantee she's going to remember playing with lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And that is the type of experience we're talking about here. And if you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do that. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. And what that means is, and by the way, it's free. You register where your property is and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of. Either you're cutting your lawn in half, or maybe you're reducing your lawn by 1 square foot. I don't care what it is. Maybe you're putting an aster in a flower pot out on your balcony. That all counts. And maybe you're protecting a woodlot behind your house. You don't actually have to do anything. But what we're trying to do is get a visualization. When you do that, your little piece of the earth is going to light up within your county, and then eventually on the big map here, so we can see where all of this public effort towards conservation is happening. Yes. It's our effort at social media. I don't do social media, but people say you only talk to the choir. That's kind of true. Because it's only the choir who invites me, but we need to reach the millions of people who don't realize they are an essential component of conservation in the future. And we're hoping that joining the Homegrown National Park tribe will help us do that. So please join Homegrown National Park. We're gonna reduce the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that used to be lawn? Some of them, I'm going to argue, need to be keystone species. Remember what a keystone is. This is Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out, the arch collapses. I call these plants keystone species because they're making most of the food. If you take a keystone plant out of the food web, or if you take all your keystone plants out of the food web collapses. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of keystone plants as the 2x4s that are holding up the ecological house that you're building on your property. They're essential. You cannot build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. Now, you're not through building your ecological house when you have your keystone plants, but it's a necessary start. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? That's how we started out talking. And on average, they certainly are. But there's a number of native plants that don't contribute all that much either. So the real question is, do we want to put the most powerful plants in our landscapes, the ones that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? If we do want to, we have to choose the right plants. What is the most powerful plant in terms of making caterpillars in the country? It's one of the oaks, genus Quercus. We've got 91 species of oaks. You in Oklahoma have 39. I counted up today. 39 species of oaks. You are well endowed with oaks. Well, where I live, Mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. And just as a comparison, tulip trees, it's another good native plant, only supports 21. Crepe myrtle, none. Ginkgo, none. So there's a huge difference in the range of plants that we choose. They support over 950 species of caterpillars nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. So if you want to know what the keystone plants are for where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both the woody plants and the herbaceous plants in your county that are supporting the most life will pop up. And these are abbreviated lists because I ran out of space. Let's focus on these herbaceous plants here for a while. Goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, way at the top, not just because they make a lot of caterpillars, but because they're also supporting more specialist bees. Like Andrena facilii only needs Facilia. Well, there's at least 44 species of bees in Oklahoma that you won't have if you don't have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers. So you're getting a lot of caterpillars, and you're supporting an awful lot of native bees when you focus on those. And I will point out to the Audubon folks, there's a similar website on the Audubon website, similar tool on the Audubon website that will help you out. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of life, a lot of insects to our property, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. There's a lot of research these days that is telling us that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines, not just here, but in Europe as well. And these are all the reasons that insects do die at lights, particularly the moths that create the caterpillars that run our food webs. But this is good news to me. It's good news because we've got to reverse insect declines, not stop it. We've got to turn it around and have insect increases. We've got to rebuild their populations. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. Now, there's a lot of switches to flick, but we can do it. But I know what you're going to say. I cannot turn the light out over my barn or my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to notice is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if even easier than that is take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is the best, because nocturnal insects are far less attracted to yellow wavelengths than they are to blue or white wavelengths. So that's a very easy fix. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we could save millions of insects and millions of dollars too if everybody switched to LEDs. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights or put in yellow lights, and then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects, it's a booming business around the country. And Mosquito Joe says it's okay because what he's fogging with is a natural product, pyrethroids, and he's right. It's a natural product. It's industrial strength natural product. It's the compound found in chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too. So I don't think that doesn't convince me. He also says it only kills mosquitoes. And I wish he was right. I really do. But it kills every insect it comes in contact with, including monarchs. There was a big monarch kill, hundreds of dead monarchs when they flew through Mosquito Joe a couple of years ago. And what the curious thing, the ironic thing is it does not control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of them. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So he's not even close to being effective, which means he has to keep coming back and charging you, and he's not cheap. This is the way you control mosquitoes in the larval stage, using biocontrol. You get a bucket and you fill it full of water. And people say, how big a bucket? I don't care. I guess the bigger the better, but fill it full of water and put in some organic matter, a handful of straw or hay, some dead leaves, probably dried grass. And what's going to happen is it creates a brew that generates algae and diatoms. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. And female mosquitoes who want to lay their eggs know that, and they will fly to your bucket. They will preferentially lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis, and this variety of Bacillus thuringiensis is specialized for aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larva. It's extremely targeted. It's also cheap. And that's the benefit here. If a dragonfly gets in your bucket eating your mosquito larvae, it's not going to hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, it doesn't hurt it. You might put a coarse screen over the bucket so your chipmunk doesn't drown itself. But as I said, it is targeted. If everybody did it, it would hit the mosquitoes where it counts, and that is in the larval stage. This also works, folks. If you're going to have a party in your backyard and you've got a lot of mosquitoes and you just want them to leave you alone, you don't have to poison the world to do it. Set up a fan and have it blowing, because the mosquitoes can't fly into strong wind. It doesn't have to be that strong either. So if I were doing it, that's what I do. Actually, I use mosquito dunks at home too. Okay, fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. Just making caterpillars on trees isn't good enough. We have to have them turn into adults. So what do I mean by that? I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars, and this is just an example. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon, which hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. I wish that was the rule, but it's really the exception. 94% of the things that develop on oaks and other trees as well finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and they wiggle their way beneath the soil if it's not too compacted, and they pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the trees, and that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the trees. We don't tolerate it. And if you don't believe me, as you're driving home, look under our trees. There's no leaf litter. And of course, the cement landscape is not going to help those caterpillars either. This is what most people do. They have a tree in the lawn, and I actually have a new grad student this year, just starting in September, who's going to measure the success of caterpillars in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. You've got a tree, and then you have maybe a dogwood, a native azalea, ferns, ground cover, lots of leaf litter in there. When they fall down from the tree, it's a soft landing. They have everything they need. The soil is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to walk on them. They can successfully pupate underground or in the leaf litter. This is a great opportunity to do more gardening. If you're looking for gardening opportunities, do your spring ephemeral gardening around your trees. Any bed that you put around a tree is going to reduce the amount of lawn you have. So you're converting a wasted space into something that's very productive, and it's also going to increase caterpillar survivorship. You can use your native ground covers, things like wild ginger or native pachysandra. There is the Virginia creeper being a great ground cover. This is golden seal. There's all kinds of options here. Mayflower, mayapple, foamflower, ferns, very effective. Be imaginative, but cover that ground. And notice, we're talking about thick plantings here, so there is no weeding opportunity, or at least it's far reduced. When you have a big bed that's covered with mulch, that's just a weeding opportunity. We can do much better than that. Make the mulch a green mulch. It will increase caterpillar survivorship a lot. And soon I'll be able to give you a number on that. Another grad student, former grad student, Desiree Narango, did some great work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. And that's good news to me. She adds one simple question. How well do chickadee populations do over time in suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants? And the first thing she found is when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've removed 75% of the bird food. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So every landscape had a nest box up, and the chickadees would come and they'd look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to mature. Now, if you take all that information and put it into a population growth model, as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, this is what you get. We focused on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this level, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population, and that happens when you have very little non-native plant biomass. But if you're below the line here, you have an unsustainable population. You are not making enough babies to replace the adults that die every year. Right here is where those lines intercept, which suggests very, very liberally that you can have up to 30% of the woody plant biomass in your yard non-native without destroying your local food web. So this is the area of compromise I'm talking about. Now, we can't allow invasive plants because, again, they're just ecological tumors. But there are plenty of ornamental plants that are not invasive. Let's go back to Dan Getman. There's a ginkgo. What is a ginkgo doing in Dan Getman's native planting here? His wife said, Dan, I like ginkgos and I want one. And there it is. Is it destroying the ecological functionality of this landscape? No. Is it an invasive species? No. It's just there. I like to think of it as a statue. So you can have a few statues without destroying your landscape. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those contributors, of the really powerful native plants. So if we increase those contributors, everything will be great. Can we use, come back here. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. She sent it to me a couple of years ago. You don't get more formal than that. And every plant in that design, this was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal landscapes in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can you get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. We put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells the neighbor that this is intentional. It's not a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. Now, it's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would really help. And remember why we need pollinators. It's not because of agriculture, folks. It's because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, including several of our agricultural plants. And that is not an option. And the reason I mention that is because people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Yes, you do. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants. How about this? Drew Latham design. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and a number of municipalities are doing that. Minnesota kicked this off several years ago with a cost-sharing program. The state is helping people reduce or eliminate their lawn and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very successful, very popular. There's an island off of Florida that is paying people to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Now, burrowing owls, it's a listed species. And this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive ornamentals. St. Louis, Missouri did that. Fayetteville, Arkansas did that. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on them. You take out a calorie pair, you get a free tree replacement. Or give people $100 coupons, particularly in the drier states, to put in water-efficient native plants versus the inefficient non-natives. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in the far west, particularly California, this has gone up. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you take out and put a xeric replacement in. California does not have one drop to waste on cool season European grasses. And if you want more information on all these programs, memorize that. Okay. We've made 3 missteps, in my opinion, 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And we're still in the early years of conservation. We're learning how to do it. And the first one, I think, is really significant. We've started to think of nature as optional, which means it's not essential, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. That's the message I get from this. It's the message we got directly from Teddy Roosevelt. If you read his writings, we want to promote national parks all over the country because these are beautiful places, and we want future generations to be able to appreciate that. And I get it. Nature is highly entertaining, but to suggest that's the only reason we need nature is a big mistake. We need nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Now, we've also talked about whether humans and nature can coexist or not. We've got to get past that. Yes, we can coexist. If we restrict conservation just to places where there's not a lot of people, we're going to fail because those places are too few and too small. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That is not It's 71 rug fragments. It's not a functional Persian rug. And that is what we have done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, even including much of our agriculture. So we have to glue our rug back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect viable habitat, but to recreate viable habitat where we've destroyed it. And that's a lot of places. And when we do that, and it is happening, when we do that, it'll be the first time in modern history that we have actually coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely, whether they know it or not, they depend entirely on the quality of their local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Resworth, the Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You are not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching, and not just our kids, but our peers. We all have obligations to good earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. We need some empowerment right now. There's a lot of people that recognize the earth has huge problems and they feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? One person can shrink the lawn. One person can put in keystone plants. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can plant a pollinator garden. One person can remove the invasives on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can use keystone plants. One person can do a lot of things. It doesn't have to happen overnight, but one person can do a lot of things that will completely revitalize the little ecosystem on their piece of the earth, and which will then contribute to greater local ecosystems rather than detract for them. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet. You will get depressed. Just worry about your piece of the planet, the piece that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Dr. Tallamy will be available for book signing after this. Thank you.